Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. Well, I say at the National Library of Scotland, but of course, due to restrictions, I'm actually talking to you from my living room, which is quite cosy, and you are more than welcome to be here. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Alastair McIntosh, who's here to talk about his new book, Riders on the Storm, the Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being. Alastair has been described by the BBC as one of the world's leading environmental campaigners. He is writer, broadcaster, speaker, and activist, who is involved in a wide range of contemporary issues, from land reform, globalization and non-violence to psychology, spirituality and ecology. I know we're in for a lovely webinar, so hopefully over to you, Alastair.
Thank you, Kenny. Am I on okay?
You are.
Yep, I'm on. My goodness, Kenny, you look like you're in the National Art Gallery behind you there, and I think I'm the only one who looks like I'm in the National Library, if I can just tilt my screen away a bit without knocking everything over. Thank you so much to you and to your colleagues and to the folk at Berlin who have published Riders on the Storm. And what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so, but I'd like to leave plenty of time for discussion for people's questions and so on. And I'd like to briefly outline why I wrote this book and the main themes that I've covered in it. So in 2008, Berlin, the Scottish publisher, leading Scottish publisher, published my book, Hell and High Water, about climate change. And Hugh Andrew, the managing director, came back to me just over a year ago and said, how about doing an update? Because COP26, the United Nations Conference of the Parties, the 26th Conference of the Parties, the heads of government meeting together, is going to be happening in Glasgow. So how about an update? And I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. What interests me is the psychology and even the spirituality of the times we are in, and how that relates to climate change and how we might respond to it. So Hugh said, okay then, and I set going on that. However, I quickly found that in order to do that, I needed to re-ground myself in the current science of climate change, not least because the ground had changed and the ground was hotly contested between, on the one hand, climate change deniers who say it's not happening, or if it is, there's nothing we can do about it. And in a much more tapered, but nevertheless important way, climate change alarmists who say things like, we're all going to be extinct by 2026 in the case of one alarmist, or we're going to see mass human dieback caused by climate change to just 1 billion or so people being supported by the planet by the end of this century. So I needed to get a bearing on where I was coming from. And I was hugely helped in that, folks, by the fact that the foremost international scientific body on climate change, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, set up by the United Nations, had just published 3 major special reports. And the order in which I've taken them on in this book here is, I start off with what was actually the last one to be published, but in this book I needed to start off by grounding you in what's actually happening according to the scientists with climate change. So I start off with the one about oceans and the cryosphere, oceans and ice. And I summarize in, I hope, easy to understand terms, what is in that special report. I then move on to the one on climate change on the land and how that affects human life. And then I move on to the one which has had the most impact, containing global warming within 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at most 2 degrees centigrade. So what I've done in this book is I've summarized each of those chapters. And let me put it to you like this. The position that the science shows is profoundly alarming, but it's not as alarming as some of the alarmists make out. Now, why is it important to make that distinction? Why is it important not to exaggerate the science, just as it's important not to underplay the science? I take the view, and some people would criticize this view, but I take the view that we only know what we think we know about the science of climate change because of the science of climate change. And if we think we know better than what the consensus expert science is saying, consensus, in other words, not just 1 or 2 outlier scientists on one side or another, but what happens when you get them all together in a room, like there's just been a big gathering of the world's top oceanographers, some 60 of them came together in a room and reconfirmed expectations for sea level rise. What happens when they put their heads together and say, what can we agree upon? The consensus expert science, in other words, not any old person who has perhaps published in a vanity journal, if they have published at all, but serious scientists with a reputation worth not losing. What do they say about the situation? The consensus expert science. And so what happens when you get that together? And when you get such a gathering of people together, what you find is that what has been expressed, especially in the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, is profoundly alarming for the future. But if we exaggerate it beyond what it actually says, we make out that we have got no time left. And the problem with making out, in my opinion, that we have got no time left is that we then contract the possibilities for the future. We then find ourselves taking panic measures, like, for example, geoengineering solutions that would put things up into space, whether it's sulfur gases or whether it's mirrors reflecting the sun's radiation back into space to try and cool the planet. And the problem with that is that it might cool the planet down, but you're then on a drip feed. You're like a drug addict. You're always going to have to keep it going, because if you turn it off, all of a sudden the planet's going to heat up. And furthermore, you're not going to stop the oceans of the world getting more and more acid. So my argument is we must be realistic about what time we might have available to save the planet while we can in the wisest ways that we can. And that knee-jerk reactions are not going to be the way forward. It's got to be considered policy. And if we believe in democracy, folks, it's got to be policy that can take people with the process. Otherwise, the politicians leading that process will simply be voted out. So that is my basis for saying we only know, or mostly only know, what we think we know about climate science from the climate science, and why it's so important to be humble in how we approach it. If we are not climate scientists, and I do not consider myself to be a climate scientist, although I have an earth sciences degree as my first degree, a BSc degree from Aberdeen, although I have that as well as other degrees, I do not consider myself to be a qualified climate scientist, and therefore my role in a book like this is to summarize what is going on from those IPCC reports. So that's what I give you in the first few chapters, in the first 3 chapters specifically. That's what I give you in this book. Forgive me, I've got a hearing aid issue that here I just need to connect my phone to keep it alive so that I can still hear my voice normally. And my reason for doing that, I'll deal with that later. My reason for doing that is that I want to move on into the issues of looking at the psychology of climate change denial. And then even further than that, I want to look at alarmism and what kind of activism we need in the future in order to have a grounded approach that can take the human condition forward. Because my analysis is that when you look at all the scientific and technical solutions that there are for dealing with climate change, and they are there, the IPCC's 1.5 report shows that technically it would be possible to live within 1.5 degrees to constrain the the greenhouse gas emissions so that we have 1.5 degrees or no more of global warming. It would be possible, but the problem, as the IPCC repeatedly points out, is the political acceptability. The problem is that if you're going to take over vast areas of land, for example, to grow trees and then burn the trees in power stations and pump the carbon dioxide underground where you've got the capacity to do that, yes, you can do those things in principle, but what's going to be the effect on other land use and so on? You're into big political problems there. So my conclusion is that we have to look at two main things which are frequently off the agenda in discussing this. They're off the agenda because they're uncomfortable things to look at. We have to face the reality that in simple back of an envelope terms, greenhouse gas emissions are what you get when you multiply our human population by our levels of consumption. Now, I was born in 1955. I'm 64, about to turn 65 now. And in my lifetime, world population has increased threefold. So you might say, oh, well, the problem is then, you know, too many people in China and India and Africa and all the rest of it. Well, actually, the bigger problem is too many of us who are high consumers. The bigger problem is that carbon dioxide emissions from consumption have grown sixfold over that time. Consumption emissions, consumption, if you like, has outstripped population by twofold. And my view is that we need to tackle both of those things. Ideally, we need a world with a lower level of population, but also with much lower levels of material consumption. And it would be said, well, you can't go there. You know, population control, forced sterilization, whatever, you can't go there. Well, I think the world has changed. I have, let me see if I can just find this graphic here. Look at that little pyramid there. Berlin was so helpful in helping me to lay it out as a pyramid like that. Because when you look at what brings down population levels in the country, I've summed them up as respect, equality for women, education for women, voting rights for women, economic opportunity for women, urban or well-connected rural living, family welfare and security in old age, good perinatal care and low infant mortality, effective planning services and late family start. And lastly, and this one is particularly pertinent, resolving patriarchal domination and violence in society. I say particularly pertinent because we heard yesterday that the UK government's hosting committee for COP26 is going to be made up entirely of men. And one wonders what that is signaling to the rest of the world. So population is important, but the much bigger thing is consumption. The much bigger thing is consumption. And there I move in this book towards what it is that drives our need to consume. I mentioned that my first degree was in earth sciences from the geography department in Aberdeen University. But my second degree was an MBA at Edinburgh University. And I went and studied business because I wanted to know how the world works. And you see, when I write my books, these are the kind of things that I'm threading through. So what interested me in that kind of study was not so much the kind of stuff that was on the main curriculum, not the kind of stuff you'd get in marketing from Philip Kotler's standard textbook of marketing, which I found very bland, but rather what you find really goes on behind the scenes. And I refer a lot to this ancient book, The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. Look at how many tags I've got in to it there. When was this published? It was first published in 1957, 2 years after I was born. And you see, what's important in this book is that Kotler went out just after the Second World War, when the American government especially was trying to stimulate consumerism. Instead of satisfying needs, it was trying to create wants in order to maintain the economy on the war footing it had been in. And what did they do? Well, again, you won't hear about this in most standard marketing courses, but if you go to a specialist field known as consumer behaviour, you'll find it in books like this. What they basically engaged in was motivational manipulation. They used the therapeutic insights of psychologists like Jung, Freud, and Adler. And instead of using them to heal the human soul, they used it to drive, it tells you here in the subtitle, to drive consumer behavior and beyond. And you've got here user, pair, buyer, user, pair, buyer, user, pair, buyer, etc. So I argue that we're living in a world where high levels of consumerism have been constructed. I define consumerism as consumption beyond what is necessary for dignified sufficiency of life. And that, if you like, brings us to the subtitle of this book, which is The Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being. Because I believe the wider crisis we are in is one of what it means to be a human being. I want to screen share now, and I just want to give you some images that will help to put flesh on some of what I'm saying. Just bear with me where I've gotten to. The survival of being and the way in which the kind of consumer-driven world in which our very sense of self-worth is hijacked to drive more and more stuff. Because towards the end of the book, I look at what I call the 4 C's. And I'm just going to lead you into this if I can successfully screen share. Bear with me if this goes wrong. Where's my PowerPoint? Here we go. And if I share that, now hopefully Kenny will shout if this is not working, but you should now see a title screen. And let me take you to the very first chapter in the book here, where I start off talking about a year ago, when my wife Vera Nicholas and I, through the Centre for Human Ecology, brought a group, or were hosts to a group, from West Papua province in Indonesia, the Indonesian side of New Guinea. And we took them on a study tour of the Isle of Lewis and Harris. These are community leaders, many of them grassroots community leaders. And we brought them on a study tour looking at healthy communities, healthy land, and how community land trusts like the North Harris Trust here were helping people to reconnect with place and to live more sustainably with their environment, not least through local renewable energy initiatives. But what I really want to focus on, folks, with you here, is taking them home to my home village there. There's Shawnee MacDonald, Rusty, the village blacksmith, who I was at school with since the age of 4. There's Evelyn Cool MacLeod, Catherine Mary McLean, of a younger generation from the village. And there's our village of Lurbost there. And I'm going to take you over here. Do you see that green area? Why is it so green? What is going on over there? I'm going to take you over there. And we get over there and we see the fishing boats are all rotting away because the fishing was destroyed by overfishing and so on. But I want to home in on something else. Can you see these lines coming down the hillsides here? Those are what we call the Fiannagan. the Fiannagan in the Gaelic, the lazy beds, the raised beds. And you can see that they're all being eaten away by the sea. You know, when I was a boy, these would have finished several meters before the sea. The sea would probably have been coming up to about here when I was a boy. And look at them now. The coastline is literally being nibbled away. And that's because since I was a boy, global sea level has risen by about 6 inches. And that 6 inches combined with greater storminess and greater wave height is what's causing this loss of the land. But that was just a passing stop, because where we were really headed to on this journey is we're headed over here. And let me just take you over there. We're going to go and sit. We gathered shellfish, we gathered mussels and cockles, and we made ourselves a feast sitting in these ruins. And then Evelyn here, Evelyn piped up. And as we were eating our mussels, she said, well, it's a long time since there will have been a meal held in this house. Because this was a house of one of her grannies. And the history of this village, the history of all of south of Lewis, south of that line that runs through Loch Lurbost there. So you've got Lurbost over here, and south of this line in the village of Croigery, where we are here, there's our pot for the mussels. That land was cleared of its people in the 1820s. And the reflection, the meditation, if you like, that I have in this book is I am asking around the world, whether you're in West Papua province with its initially Dutch colonization, and then what happened with the Indonesian dictatorship. It now has special autonomy, a bit like Scottish devolution, which is how these folk were able to come over and spend time here. But across the world, we're looking at a history where people have been uprooted from their place, where people have been uprooted from their communities, where people become anonymous, where the only thing you have is what you consume. So I suggest that historically we've been through processes of clearance, that leads to an inner psychological collapse, which leads us vulnerable to consumption, to consumerism. And all the more so in America. And in the book, I quote Vance Packard, the American writer, talking about the hillbillies, people like himself from Appalachia, who he identifies as hillbillies, his book, Hillbilly Elegy. And he says, I don't know what it is, but there's something going on with us. There's something spiritual going on. We've just not got our acts together, especially the men. And my analysis is that they're very deeply uprooted. And one of the people, one of the families evicted from just south of where we are here was a family called Smith. They were forced under brutal circumstances to another part of the island. In 1912, after we've counted 7 layers of cultural trauma on the island at that time, one of the daughters, Mary Ann, emigrated to America, where she met a man called Frederick Christ Trump. And if Trump is re-elected, he's going to pull America out of the international climate change process. And I speculate that part of Trump's support base is similarly dislocated. It is similarly disconnected from people and place. And I treat that just as one of many possible icons in the world, one of many possible insights into our loss of community. And I suggest that what's happening in Scotland today with community land, what's happening with our community land trusts, is that people are reconnecting. And that when the COP26 process comes to Scotland, digging back to our ancient roots through to where we stand now, perhaps these are some specific things that we might share with the world. So there we are, Kenny and Joe. I think that's me said enough now. that leaves us another 20 minutes for questions. So over to you to field those for me.
That's been great, Alastair. Thank you so much for the time. And as you say, we've got time for a Q&A. And for those people who are just thinking of their questions, you can type them in and we'll field them to Alastair. But I think for now, Joe, who's joined me, you have the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alastair, you mentioned that COP26 is being held in Scotland. Delegates will be interested, I'm sure, in things that are happening in the local area. Are there any initiatives or anything that's been going on that you think that we could particularly showcase?
Yes, yes. I mean, I've already suggested one. I think land reform is so important. You know, I mentioned in the book, for example, the Point in Sandwich Trust. Now, the Point in Sandwich Trust is a development trust, but it's on the land of the Stornoway Trust, which is one of the, if not the longest standing community trusts in Scotland. And what they've done is, you know, they just went ahead and they got bank loans. They eschewed the corporate option. They got bank loans and they put up 3 wind turbines, which by today's standards are of a modest size. And you know what, from those 3 wind turbines, not only are they kind of making their own community net zero carbon by producing all that energy, but last year they distributed £800,000 back into the community. So whenever you look at one of those corporate wind farms or landowner-owned wind farms in Scotland, and think if 3 of those turbines can produce nearly £1 million of profit a year, what's being exported elsewhere from Scotland? And what would happen if we were more empowered as a people to take that on? And so this is where I think the IPCC's report on climate change and land is so important. Do you know, Joe, that 40% of the authors of that report, and there were hundreds of authors of that report, 40% of them are women. Wow. Over half of them are from countries of the South, from so-called third world countries. Mm. And what they're doing is they're zeroing in on things like the United Nations goals for sustainable development. There's 17 of them. And I know that many people will mock the idea of sustainable development because it's been hijacked and distorted as being sustainable economic growth. But when you look at it properly, we've already got the ground plan there. We just need to live what is there. So I hope that kind of thing will be showcased. You know, if COP26 are coming to Glasgow, there are community energy programs close to Glasgow. I think of the Fintry Development Trust, for example, which is a wonderful example. I'm sure that they would be willing to show people around. We've taken Papuans to visit that, and it was very edifying. You know, we have, what we've got in Scotland is we've got community. It's not just a technofix. We've got people doing it. And when people own it, Joe, and folks listening, when people own it and people are getting the benefit, then they want climate change action. And that's what needs to be built into our Green New Deals, the whole community ownership dynamic of these changes.
Makes it much less scary, I think, doesn't it? If you can have some kind of integral part of that. Thank you.
Not just less scary, but it's beautiful, and it creates wealth. You know, people say, oh, you know, you can't, it's going to make everybody impoverished. Well, not if you've got 800 grand a year churning into projects to keep your kids having exciting experiences and all the rest of it. Goodness, it almost becomes a kind of consumerism in its own right. And do you know that, I'm sorry, Joe, but you know, Gordon Cowtown of Fintry Development Trust, before the COVID hit, he was actually going to come and see me with some of these people, and we were going to sit down and have a blether because they were wondering how most wisely they can use the resources for the common good in their wind farm. The fact that this is happening in Scotland today is a wonderful example for the world.
Yeah, inspirational.
Yeah, Alastair, you've said how towards the end of the book you analyse the human predicament today in terms of the 4 C's. 4 C's being clearance, collapse, consumption and community. And you give Scotland's land reform as a case study in ways to tackle climate change. Could you say just a little more about that?
Well, for those of you who don't know Scotland, since the 1990s, we've had a modern Scottish movement for land reform. So starting with communities like Assynt, Egg and Gear, I was involved in the one on the island of Egg. We've had a move to replace conventional landlordism with land trusts where communities own the land, I would prefer to say hold the land, and they elect their own trustees or directors. So, you know, in the case of the Egg Trust, they've got 8 directors. 4 of them are elected by the local community, 2 of them by the Scottish Wildlife Trust, because the Wildlife Trust did so much to raise the money that made the buyout possible, and 2 from Highland Council. And with that balance, they govern their own place. In other places, it's entirely from the local community that they periodically elect their directors. And then once they are in place, once they own the land, they've got the power to decide whether to set up a village hydro scheme or solar panels. On Egg, I mean, you get people coming from all over the world now to study Egg because they've set up their entire sort of local national grid, Egg electricity. If you Google it on YouTube, you'll find some wonderful videos, especially from Al Jazeera, about what they've achieved. And so, you know, not only are they producing their own electricity and so being locally carbon neutral or very near so, but they're also running it themselves. And, you know, they pay in, obviously, for getting the electricity, but then they use the money to pay themselves for looking after it. It's just wonderful stuff. Same in all, you know, so many of these other ones. In Gear, they've got 3 small wind turbines, and they call them the Dancing Ladies, Faith, Hope and Charity. And they help to fund the trust. On Harris, they've just, a couple of years ago, they completed a 100 kilowatt hydroelectric scheme on the river at Brunavanyada and so on. These are the kind of things that people are doing. And you see, it's not corporations doing it, and it's not governments having to do it for the people. It's not being done to anybody, but rather nothing about us without us is for us. And this is about us and it's for us, and that's why it's working.
Thanks very much for that. Over to you, Jill.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question is quite a tricky one, so hopefully won't throw you in anyway, but it sounds quite an interesting one. So
we like tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. So Iria has asked, hi Alastair, you mentioned resolving patriarchal domination and violence as being a way that we'll be able to reduce the hidden persuaders' power to push forward over consumption. Can you suggest some ways in which people can begin to address this? Thank you.
I hope I've just given an example by naming it. And I think it's especially important that men name it. And if we're white men, we also name issues of race and the advantage that being white has. And if we are either from or have become of a middle-class background by virtue of our education or whatever, we also name class privilege. So these various ways in which domination systems can take form need to be named. And then, you know, what do? We call it out. I have just called out the UK government for having appointed a hosting committee that is all men. You know, last night I almost tweeted saying, you know, what if women were to boycott engagement with the UK hosting committee? And then I started to type it and then I deleted it because I thought, actually, it's not my place to suggest that. And okay, I've kind of just done it, so to speak, but I've done it in the context of, you know, recognizing what was appropriate and not appropriate for me to do. I think our place is to acknowledge these dynamics. You know, I am very aware of the advantages that my color and class and gender has given me in life as a man being born in 1955. I think if we name those things, we start to break it down, and then we can take it from there. Then we can take it from there by creating the space, especially for listening, and especially not blocking space when we are in a position to do so. So, I mean, sometimes if I get invited to give a talk, I'll say, who's on the panel? And if it's an all-male panel, I accept that sometimes, sometimes with something specialist, it may not be possible to have gender equality. I do accept that. I'm not rigid like that, but I will always question it. And if it does have to be an all-male panel, I'll make a point of acknowledging that, although it's, it's uncomfortable to do so.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear.
It is, absolutely. Alastair, we've now got a question from Sandy Snedden. Sandy, thank you for attending tonight's webinar. He first up says, Alastair, thank you for your talk. Then goes on to say, your plea for sustainable living in order to save our planet is well made and necessary to hear. How do we persuade people to live more sustainable when many people see air travel, foreign holidays, disposable fashion, and the rest as something they are entitled to?
Yeah. I should say that in this book, I do not come out for a hair shirt type of green approach. I think we are where we are, and we are where we are because we live in a world which is fueled by the energy intensity of fossil fuels. And we still haven't developed and implemented the technical means that can reduce that. Now, in my own case, in this house, and Vren and I living in a end terrace house here in Govan in Glasgow, we have cut our carbon footprint our domestic carbon footprint by 63% over the past 7 years by putting solar panels on the roof and putting in an air sourced heat pump. So we're getting energy off the roof, and that then heats the house. If you go on my website, you will see how to do that. But I always say to people, that is a privileged position. First of all, we were able to invest £7,000 in what was doing that. It paid itself back after 5.5 years and should go on paying for another 20 odd years or something like that. But we were able to make that initial start. And, I had the technical know-how because I'd been involved in setting up small-scale hydro in Papua New Guinea in the 1970s. And so I kind of knew what was valid and what wasn't valid. Not everybody's able to do that. But that is an example of the kind of thing that we can do in very practical terms. And that's obviously quite a dramatic example. Outside, we've got compost bins and everything goes back onto the garden, and all of that kind of routine green stuff, if you like. But I think what your question is perhaps more deeply getting at, Kenny, is the psychology that drives all of this. When we live in a world where we have been led to think that we're only somebody if we have something, to have is to be, as Eric Fromm puts it, how do we start to discharge that one? How do we start to defuse that one? I remember my friend John Seed, the Australian rainforest activist, when he was involved in a campaign against gold mining, he came up with a caption, "Cold shoulder gold." Do we need to have gold, or at least so much of it? I have a silver wedding ring. My wife has a gold one. That was our compromise. Can we just, tone it down a bit? Do we have to go that far? Can we just go more lightly on things? And then if the answer is yes, how do we do that? I think that the only way we do it, Kenny, is by starting to value inner things more. The Black American poet Alice Walker, she had a wonderful poem, if I can remember it. She says, "We alone can devalue gold by not caring if it rises or falls in the marketplace. Feathers, shells, and C-shaped stones are all as precious. This could be our revolution. to value what is plentiful as much as what is scarce. I think I've not quoted it quite right, but I infilled where I wasn't too sure. You'll get the spirit of it. So, you know, to me, that is the way forward. And we're only going to do that by deepening our inner lives. We're only going to do that by understanding the way in which our psychological vulnerabilities have been hijacked by the motivational manipulators, how it's been hijacked, and then reclaiming literally ourselves. And for me, that starts to become a spiritual matter. That starts to become a matter of what does it really mean to be a human being? Are we just egos walking about on legs of meat, here today, gone tomorrow, in which case nothing really matters? Or is there more to us than that? And that is where in my final chapter of the book, I turn to that aspect of the survival of being with a number of reflections based upon experiences with the Papuans and the Hebrides, but also drawing in some insights from Chinese Taoist thought into what the nature of life might offer to us if we can unhitch from these addictions.
Thanks for that, Alastair. We've got time still for a couple more questions. Joel, do you have the next question?
Absolutely, yep. So the next question is, what positive thing has COVID highlighted in terms of all of these issues that we've been discussing? And we've got a wee PS, we can also add ULVA to community ownership.
Sorry, come again on that last bit?
We can also add ULVA to community ownership.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what COVID has done is it has made us aware of our international interconnectedness. The way we live in I mean, this webcam I'm using to speak to you, you'll see it's better than a normal computer, what I hope it is anyway. And, you know, I had to pay double the normal price for that because with the book coming out, I was asked to do a number of these types of events. And the reason for that is that, you know, these are made in China. It's an international supply chain. COVID has drawn out our vulnerability to having outsourced so much stuff. You know, 40% of the UK's carbon footprint, something like that, is carried by the Chinese, and then we blame them for it. So COVID has done that. COVID has also made us aware of our interconnection together. It's made us aware of you know, what's important in relationships, why each other matters. One of the wonderful things, just to tie in with your community land thing, is that if you want to know more about community land ownership in Scotland, go to the website of Community Land Scotland, which is the organisation that networks between these different groups, and you'll find out all about it there. But one of the things that they've got, I think it was in the news section, you'll find it somewhere there, is that they've done a study of how community land groups have helped local communities respond to COVID. So basically what happened is that when the lockdown hit, who's going to organise getting medicines to vulnerable people, getting meals to elderly people and all the rest of it? And what happened is, you know, lo and behold, it was often either the community land trusts or the development trusts, which are not dissimilar. It was those kind of organisations that had the organisation, you know, they had the offices with the databases, they knew who people was and all of that. They had the volunteer forces already in place, and they had, so important, the legitimacy. People trusted them. And so they're the ones that sprung into action. I was looking at one of these, I think it was down in Peebles, a development trust down in Peebles. It was saying on its website, you know, they got together a network of 300 volunteers in a very short time. Now, you know, when we talk about climate change and when we talk about the need for resilience, the ability to understand knocks, there you see very real resilience. And so this is, for me anyway, for my money and what I'm sharing in this book, reconnecting to the land and to community groups is only one part of how we tackle climate change, but it's such an important part, and it's one that every one of us can be involved with.
Lovely, thanks for that, Alastair. I've got the last question as our time is just get into that minute. We've got time for one more. So this is from Leslie McKenna. And Leslie asks, do you think there is an opportunity to help people reconnect to both themselves, the land, and the natural processes of the seasons by way of folklore, myths, and other cultural markers of the land? And could this help people find a more secure identity away from consumerism?
Oh, what a crack of a question to land on, because that's especially what I do in the last chapter.
We've kept the best to last then, so over to you.
Thank you, Kenny. You've always been very kind to me, and you've just done it yet again. I owe you a dram when we're able to do that. You know, at the end of my chapter 7, I kind of say, I kind of say, oh my goodness, it opened just at the right place, where I talk about these 4 C's. And I say these might seem like an odd assemblage, but they offer me a framework to dive down very deep into that inundating murky river of the dream mentioned earlier. What follows will be neither definitive nor exclusive of other points of view, but I do promise it will contain surprises. Much of what I share from here on will be impressionistic, a case of showing and not just telling. Leave this book at this point if you only need the material of the earlier chapters. Otherwise, come with me if you wish. We'll rejoin people on the land along the Hebridean scenic route. And I go on to quote my old friend Sir Bernard Narakobi, who was a director of the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation when I was its financial advisor in the 1980s. And Bernard, who was very concerned about the recovery of indigenous ways to lead us not back to the past, but forward into the future. He had a poem on the wall of our offices there in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea that read, "Welcome to the university. The ancient, timeless, eternal University of Melanesia. The village where courses are offered in living." And you'll say to me, how come you're saying this from Govan? How come you're saying this from an urban area with your house backing onto a factory and the Victorian school there? Well, that's because Varen and I live here because we're involved with the Galgale Trust, which builds traditional boats. But what it's really about doing is reconnecting people with story, reconnecting with people with place, getting people out onto the River Clyde there, people who couldn't afford normally to go out into the countryside. And I tell you, you know, when you see, I remember one day we went up to Loch Lomond there, and one of the lassies burst into tears, and we said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I never thought I would see Loch Lomond." And she was born in Glasgow. Now you see what happens, and when we take our folks to Iona, as we do once a year when we're able to, we reconnect with our deep story. We reconnect what it means to be a rooted people. We call the Galgale because Gal means the stranger, and there is something of the stranger in us all. I mean, I was born in Doncaster, my mother is English. And there's something of the Gael, of the Gaelic heartland people in us. I have 2 grandparents who are Gaelic speaking. My father was Scottish. I grew up on the Isle of Lewis. So we say we're all Galgale now. Wherever we are from, we must make community with this place on which we walk, with one another, with whom we live. And I believe that in order to have the motivation to care for the earth and to live more simply and yet more fully, that synthesis of soil, of soul, and of society is where our hope lies. And I also believe that the United Nations with its 17 sustainable development goals, has a wisdom that understands that, and let's back that and pull things in that direction when COP26 comes to Glasgow in November of next year. I wish the Scottish Government and everybody else, including the UK government, well in helping that process to be a success, because it matters for the future of the world.
Alastair, thank you so much for such an interesting, engaging talk, as always, I have to say. Can I just say that should you like a copy of Alastair's book, you can go to our online shop via the link on the event booking page, or we will send you a link in our survey feedback email going out tomorrow. The book normally retails at £9.99, but thanks to Alastair's publishers, we have a special event price of £7.99. So please take advantage of that. Can I just remind you that Joe and myself are back next week at 5 p.m. when we're joined by journalist Todd Westbrook, who will be here to talk about his latest book, Revolution, a short, sharp history of Scottish wind power. Should be another great webinar. Finally, as always, on behalf of the National Library of Scotland, thank you everyone who has joined us this evening. Today is officially the first day of autumn, and I know the days might be getting a little bit shorter and nights are drawing in, but we hope that we've put together a programme of events for the coming weeks and months, and I hope that they'll be able to brighten up your evenings and entertain you. So we hope you can join us for them. But for now, as always, stay safe, be kind to yourself, and bye for now.